But one thing I just wanted to say as we start is several people have pointed out to me about the irony, shall we say, of the Simon Institute doing polls, because Paul Simon had some ambivalence about polls, it should be said. Now, I think to be fair, what he had real strong view is about politicians who slavishly studied polls and followed every machination and used polls to determine how they should vote. He had no real respect for them. But I think he appreciated the importance that polls can play, well-constructed polls, in providing a snapshot of public opinion. And I think they're also can be really good tools for students, other researchers, to really understand what's happening in the community. And here I'd like to give a shout out to John Jackson in particular, because he and his several colleagues put together a remarkable paper a couple years ago which traced the gridlock in Illinois over this last decade and did a deep dive into the polls to give a better sense of why this was about, and showed through their polling how we've come to a pretty difficult place where the level of services that people of Illinois want seems to be more than they're willing to pay for. And then we also have the additional problem of leaders who are not particularly inclined to point out that discrepancy to them. And so we've had a really difficult time in the state. So with that, let me just turn it over to John, who will give the opening remarks on the poll.
Thank you, John. This is something of a test of whether I can walk and chew gum at the same time, because I got to change my notes and operate this slide projector and all of that. But what we're going to do very briefly, if all this works right, is to walk you through some of the major results of this poll that we've just finished. Some of you will have seen some of the news release coverage of it, particularly in the Southern, which has been very good about turning loose of our press releases as we got them done. So I won't tarry very long on any single slide, and then Linda's going to follow me, and then, as John said, question and answer time. So let's see how that works. Yay, that's the right starting place. We start with the governor's race, naturally. And there. We have, just for setting the stage, a statewide poll, 1,001 respondents. We asked them whether they were going to vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary, or whether they were likely to vote in each of those. And they could say Democrat, Republican, or don't plan to vote, or other. And so we went from there. So you're looking at, excuse me, those who said they were going to vote in the Republican primary. Probably not a surprise to you. It's reasonably close, but not all that close. 51-31, I'd rather be Bruce Rauner than Jeannie Ives in that particular combination. It'll be tough for her to catch up in the time that's left. Ordinarily, the only way you can catch up in that kind of a situation is to have a ton of money and outspend the opponent by about 6-1, and nobody can outspend Bruce Rauner, so that's not going to happen. She has actually, for a challenger, had a pretty reasonable amount of money. She got a ton of money from Richard Uline and other big-time funders, and she's been on television. I watched 5 o'clock news, and she was there twice just tonight with yet another flight of new commercials. But Bruce Rauner matches that and then exceeds it. So I'd say she's got her work cut out for her, but we can come back to that or anything else I say at the end. Democrats, same deal. Those who said they're likely to vote in the Democratic primary. That one's a bit closer. You got, of course, the difference there is 10%, 31-21 of Pritzker over Biss that we found in second place, followed fairly closely by Kennedy at 17 in third place. I'd say that one is probably a toss-up, but leans Pritzker. Again, they're not going to outspend him, and he's been on television a lot. His problem is he's been on television a lot by ads paid for by the governor, which is very unusual, and they are not complimentary and not doing him any good. In fact, they've clearly done him some harm. And I've been here a long time. I can't remember. I've seen this in other states a few times. I can't remember in Illinois a major incumbent or any other figure in one party playing that heavy a role in the other party's primary. They usually hold fire, of course, until there's a nominee. The party organization, I think, is pretty clearly behind Pritzker. That counts for something in primaries. Also, the undecideds are there. That counts for something. But the undecideds are not really all that huge. They're bigger than in the Republican side, but nevertheless, I'd say probably leans Pritzker. It's possible that there would be an upset, but if you add both Kennedy to Biss, you get about 38%. So if one or the other of those had dropped out or hadn't ever gotten in the first place, it would probably be a lot closer and more interesting race. Okay, we went back to the 1,000 respondents there. These are people, a sample of registered voters. We put them head to head with those we thought were the most likely, Rauner versus Pritzker, and in the other we chose Biss. Turned out he came in second, so yeah, that worked out. And 48-34 if it were to be Rauner versus Biss, and 50-35 if it were to be Rauner versus Pritzker. One way you can look at that is it's Rauner versus anybody else, and it's pretty consistent no matter what. Democrats are at about 50%, and he's at about 35%, no matter the cast of characters. That's one thing, at least, that I drew as the lesson of that particular slide. Now, quickly, let's go on to the Attorney General. And this one, I think, is interesting for what it doesn't tell you, in the sense that nobody knows either of these very well. They're almost completely unknown. 2/3 of the voters haven't made up their mind. And I was a little surprised that Erica Harold is not doing better, because she is the party organization establishment favorite. Bruce Rauner gave her a ton of money recently. I would have actually thought she'd be doing a little better than that. But still, it's whatever that is, 18-14. I guess I would say, who knows, competitive leans maybe to the party organizational favorite, because, again, in Illinois, party organizations count for something. Talking about one that splatters all over the place, that's what happens when you have all that many candidates. About all that you can say there is it's a race between Quinn and Senator Kwame Raoul. Kwame Raoul is clearly the party organizational favorite, especially the party in and around Chicago and suburban, and Pat Quinn is Pat Quinn. Everybody knows Pat Quinn. He hadn't spent any money, but everybody knows him. He's got, which is a big, big challenge in primaries, of course. Kwame Raoul is essentially unknown downstate and still unknown, although much better known in Chicagoland. And then there's a whole bunch of others, and they're all at 3, 4, or 5%. Who knows? Everybody that knows Pat Quinn almost has strong opinion about his term and a half in the governor's office, and there's a bunch of them that are very negative and some of them that are positive. So we'll see how that works out. But that's an interesting one for what we really don't yet know about how that's going to come out, although I'd rather be Pat Quinn or Senator Raoul than any of the others in that particular race. Okay, job approval. This is a standard that posters use. Do you approve of the job that the incumbent, whoever, is doing? We start with the president. President's in some trouble in Illinois. I think you can conclude about 2/3 to 1/3 roughly, 62% disapprove. And of course, his approval there is 36, which is really just about exactly on the national results for months now. For a while, he was running 35 to 40. No, he was running 30 to 35. Then after the tax cut came in for a bump, he got about 2 or 3 weeks, it was 35 to 40. And then really starting with about the Florida shooting, he dropped back to 30 to 35 in most polls. So the fulcrum there is 35, and what we've got him at 36. So come back to that in a little bit. The governor. Governor's also in some trouble on job approval. 63 to 31. Again, almost 2 to 1. He's underwater, what we call underwater by negative 32%. Not a good place to be if you're an incumbent, especially a first-term incumbent with all the money in the world and already spending money for the last year and a half. So that's a problem if you're an incumbent. So what does the governor say? Madigan, Madigan, Madigan. He is more unpopular than I am, and so all the commercials out there, the governor's paying for how bad Mike Madigan is. For those old-timers in the audience, I did a review of this for a reporter yesterday, and I pointed out this used to be Richard J. Daley. You know, the Chicago Machine, Mayor Daley, we all thought of him as the villain, and for all those years it was easy to sell. Then it was Richard J. first, and then it was Richard M., the son. And that worked, but it didn't ever quite work as well as Richard J. Daley, it seems to me. And for whatever reason, the mayor currently, Rahm Emanuel, has failed as a bogeyman for the state in the sense that he really doesn't get that role. It's been played now by Madigan ever since Richard J. Daley was in. So he's the opposition. He's the reason you ought to vote for the governor, according to the governor anyway. How much longer that will work, I think, remains to be seen, but you've seen that all over your television. There's another way of looking at the same thing. Madigan versus Rauner. The speaker is worse off than the governor. On the other hand, keep in mind, the speaker doesn't have to run statewide. He's got to win one small district in Chicago, and the governor's got to run statewide. So that is a pretty significant difference. So the governor's got to run for, which he's doing, of course, consistently against Madigan being the villain. The fact that we've been doing this for 10 years now. We've done 12 statewide polls over 10 years. It has the advantage of longitudinal data and some perspective. This is some perspective, I think. It'll surprise people to know that Rauner wasn't always underwater. He came into office with some goodwill. He came into office with a chance to be a successful governor and to get good reviews. He was up above water and reasonably widely approved when he came in. Rauner approval by area, not a lot of difference. He is slightly more popular downstate than he is in the burbs, and more popular in the burbs than in Central City, Chicago. Now, another advantage to longitudinal data. I think it will astonish people to know Mike Madigan wasn't always underwater. He started out when we were doing the first polling, not far above, but his nose was above water. And what has happened, I think, is a testimony to how much tons of money spent on television and other media, but especially television, can change one's image, because he has been the brunt of tens of millions of dollars spent over several different election cycles, and that's worked. People say they hate negative ads, but negative ads work, and this, I think, is a clear testimony to that proposition. He has come into the center of the bullseye just in that period of time. You didn't used to see consistent ads where people from state rep to governor are running against the other particular person who happens to be, in this case, Speaker of the House. Not really much difference. I think it's surprising that he's as bad off in Chicago, almost, as he is in the suburbs. We asked people whether or not the president's record was going to help them consider a vote for the Republican candidate for various executive offices, for the Congress, and for the Illinois General Assembly. That's a standard in polling, particularly for the Congress. Is the president's popularity or job approval going to rub off on down ballot candidates in midterm elections? It's always one of the top two drivers of how that party does in midterm elections. And so that's what you have there. And the answer is negative, and fairly negative. I think even perhaps surprisingly negative. About 55, 57, 50, 56 pretty consistently say it's going to be more of a drag, more of a negative than a positive. So my conclusion from that is don't look for Trump coattails unless you're looking at negative coattails, because it's not going to be an advantage for Republican candidates. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Linda. That's forward, that's backward. That'll go backward if you hit that one.
No, we go backwards.
Okay. Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay. The outlook of the reforms, the respondents were asked generally, what do they think about the direction that the state is going in and what the direction the country is going in? Well, if you look at the slide, it's very interesting. Clearly, the voters are not pleased with the direction that the country is going, nor are the voters pleased with the direction that the state of Illinois is going. We have done these polls since 2008, and when we began our polling, voters actually, it was pretty much the same as well. But if you look at the trend lines, it's actually getting worse. The country is, in terms of going in the right direction, 84% believe that the country is going in the wrong direction, while 84% believe that Illinois is going in the wrong direction, and 64% believe that the country is going in the wrong direction. But when asked what's going on at the local level, actually locally, there's a lot more favorable. Over 50% of those respondents believe that locally, thinking about their local elected officials, things that are going on locally with their local mayors, their local state representatives, they came out very favorable. When asked whether or not voters approved or disapproved of the 2017 tax cuts passed by the Congress and ultimately signed by the president, voters actually were not really pleased with the recent tax cuts. Overwhelming 53% of those respondents actually opposed the federal tax cuts, while 34% supported it. 80% of the Democrats opposed the tax cut, and 75% of the Republicans supported the tax cut. And so clearly on the tax issue, those respondents were polarized. You had one on one end and the other on the other end. When you look at the influence of the tax reform on voting, Illinois voters were asked whether or not the tax cuts would make them more or less likely to vote for candidates in the upcoming November election. It was clear that 33% said that it would make them more likely to vote, but 53%, with all of the debate that has gone on about the tax cuts, 56% of the respondents said it would make them less likely to vote for a candidate as a result of what happened with the tax cuts. It was mentioned earlier that one of the things when we talk about polling, Paul Simon was not a big fan of polling, but one of the things that we've really utilized these polls to do is to take a look at what's going on from a policy perspective. And so one of the things that we asked the respondents on the from a policy perspective is which party best represents your interests on the federal level, on the congressional level, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Very interesting, when asked about the parties, in Chicago, 55% said that the Democrats actually in Chicago, in Congress, actually supported their issue, and then 15% on the Republican side. 28% said Republican, 58% said Republican. 40% of the downstaters said that the Republican Party in Congress actually was the party that supported their interests in Congress. But when you look at downstate, only 31% of the Democrats said that their interest was supported in Congress. As the state and the federal government, specifically the state of Illinois, looks at ways to increase the amount of money in their coffers, the legalization of marijuana is a big policy piece that continues to come up. And we have municipal marijuana utilization currently, now the medical marijuana, but there's a lot of debate, and there's several bills in Springfield right now about what happens with the recreational use of marijuana. 3% said they were unsure. We don't know whether or not we should support it. But only 1/3% opposed it, and 2/3 of those respondents, 66%, actually said they supported the recreational use of marijuana. And there are a number of bills in the legislature right now looking at that as a way of generating revenue. And there's a lot of attention that's being paid to what happened in Colorado and whether or not that should be used in this state as a way of generating revenue. Downstaters favored the legalization of marijuana by 58 to 40% margin. Chicago favored the legalization 77% to 22%. Cook County and suburban favored 66% to 31%. And downstate, which was a surprise, 78 to 20. So as we think about what's going on with this budget, and one of the interesting things about the fact that politics being local, and the fact that when we looked at the data and talked about looking at what people believe about the direction, it was clear from this information that those individuals that were in this particular survey felt strongly about supporting those people locally, as opposed to what was going on at the state level or supporting those people at the congressional level. The last policy question that was asked on this particular poll was whether or not Illinois lawmakers should have a one-year moratorium on leaving office before they, and actually a cool-off period for a year before they could go out and become professional lobbyists. Overwhelmingly, 85% of those individuals in this particular survey thought that there should be a one-year period. The responses were similar, no matter if it was a Republican or a Democrat asking. Both parties believe that there should be a cool-off period before individuals go out and become professional lobbyists. With that, we would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. The one request we'd make is that you keep your questions relatively brief and structured as a question and directed either to the entire panel or to a particular person. So with that, the floor is open.
Steve?
Would you explain what the structure of the sample is in terms of it's weighted by geographical area, given the population of the state? Is a greater proportion of it derived from the Chicago area, and a smaller proportion of the sample derived from downstate area, so it's representative of the distribution of voters as well?
Yes, what you just said. That's it. I mean, it's structured that way for geographical area, for gender, for race, everything that we know what the universe looks like. And so it turns out pretty well most of the time. It's mostly a science, but as you know, there's some art to that. And there are different ways of accomplishing that, but those of you that know probability and how these things work, if you do random samples, you come up with a remarkably good outcome. I know pollsters took a beating in reputation in the outcome of the 2016, but most of that's bogus because the predictions were nationally on the popular vote, which is all you can do, were within the margin of error and very close. What wasn't was, of course, the predictions about the Electoral College, but that all turned on Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and what was Michigan, and polls at the state level are often not very good. So there were some failures at the state level, and that led to the Electoral College prediction being off. But that's not in a sense, it's not a function of the polling. These narratives develop, and in my opinion, that narrative's basically not correct with that caveat that I just threw in. Carl. Yeah, well, that's legitimate. There are polls and there are polls. There are a lot of polls in this state that are not worth very much, but ours is not one of them. We started out at 40%, Carl, on cell phones. We never went below 40. We're at 60 now. So we've got cell phones. It's really hard and it's really more expensive. But we go for 60 and we get 60, and we're only 40 now on landlines. And those of you who got landlines are much less likely to be called now. And, a lot of what's wrong with some state polls is they go landlines only, which is now really biased. And the other thing is a lot of polls are robocalls. And robocalls are not worth a whole lot because a lot of people don't want to talk to a recording machine. So if you see a note on there that's a robocall poll, which many of the best known polls are robocalls, in my view and most people's view that do this stuff, that's not nearly as good a way to do polling. Ours are all live interviews. Dennis, you had your hand up next.
Thank you, John. Getting back to the marijuana question,
Yes.
there seems to be a high interest in Illinois about legalizing marijuana, and what you mentioned was because of a tool to raise revenue. And I was wondering if, in your poll, if you asked specific questions about that, because there are other issues in terms of, incarceration that was based on marijuana possession and sale, and also the other issue that seems to be not talked about very often is keeping Illinois dollars in Illinois, because, the Mexican cartel, they never buy cars at Vogler Ford. They don't come back and spend the money, and the money's taken out of circulation. I was wondering if you touched on any of those issues behind the reasoning, because all that was mentioned was as a source of revenue. We certainly need another source of revenue. I was just wondering if there's other points of view that were asked about.
Those were not asked in this particular poll, but clearly the revenue piece, many of the pieces of legislation that have been introduced specifically with the eye toward revenue generation. But I think your point is well taken. There are many other reasons why the legalization does make sense. And I think as the debate continues, these numbers actually help those legislators. There are many of them who have bills. These types of numbers, many of them called us after the poll came out, because these kind of numbers help to support them as they look to introduce those bills and with the possibility of passing something this year. This helps them from a passage perspective. But I think your point is well taken. There are a number of other reasons why it would make sense.
A quick commentary on that. We've done this now, as I said, 10 years. Public opinion doesn't move very fast very often. It's usually pretty incremental, and longitudinal data just point. And this is one that, along with same-sex marriage, changed faster than almost any other issues I've ever seen in public opinion polling. It changed rapidly in Illinois, first on same-sex marriage, from civil unions to full marriage rights over a period of 2 or 3 years in Illinois, and it really changed the same way nationally. And then later, this one came along and changed nationally and Illinois that rapidly, about 3 years' time. It started, of course, with medical marijuana and then moved to recreational. Yeah. And
sticking with the marijuana, the numbers seem pretty similar, except about 75-25 in favor. Was it a similar breakdown, Republican and Democratic voters?
Yes. Yes.
yeah, go.
Thank you. A lot of the polls made sense to me. In fact, you did mention that the approval of Trump went up when the tax laws were reducing taxes, but I didn't understand why the majority of those polled in Illinois were opposed to a tax cut on their income. It just didn't make any sense.
Well, we didn't delve into any of them. We have a very limited number of questions, and your point is kind of like the one Dennis made, that is, or Carl made, one or the other, that is, it'd be good to have 2 or 3 follow-ups. We don't have enough room on the polls to delve in, and that wasn't really, we run these things. My hypothesis would be the nation's polarized, and Democrats don't like anything, and now independents are almost as negative toward Trump and anything Trump does, and this is the Trump tax cut. The tax cuts are done with borrowed money, which a few people maybe more and more understand and don't like the deficit exploding. And number 3, the Democrats are putting out the word that it's heavily weighted toward the rich, and they get way more benefits. And to the extent Democrats are ever successful in getting their message out, I think that message is getting out. They're never very good at it, but I think that one is beginning to filter through. There was another, right? Yeah.
Yes. Did you get a sense of the degree of political engagement? Usually a midterm election, primaries have a low turnout. Was there any sense of energized electorate this year in light of everything that's going on nationally?
The national polls have certainly indicated that Democrats are much more motivated than Republicans, and that, everybody that's predicting a wave election are partially predicating it on that energized. We didn't ask that question in Illinois.
Another question that we didn't delve into was the whole issue of the women's issue and the Me Too movement and what that means for women on the ballot. I think a lot of that happened after we went out with this poll, but clearly that may, and there's a lot of speculation, and there are those that are watching to see for the females on the ballot, what will that do? And so that'll be another interesting piece to take a look at. And the females in the voting booth, exactly.
We're less than 2 weeks from the, is on? Okay, we're less than 2 weeks from the election, and I've been kind of struck by the lack of advertising for the statewide races, except for the governor's race. Is there any explanation for that? Is everybody, I mean, some are probably running unopposed, but otherwise, like, you say Kwame Raoul is not known downstate. I think he'd be putting some money downstate to try to get some votes.
Well, I think that's right, and I think he is up on television in Chicago, I understand, and I think Pat Quinn came up with a flight of ads, but we haven't seen them down here. I haven't seen any AG on the Republican side at all. I don't know, maybe the governor's race has soaked up all the money, I don't know, but there's not really much going on in my view.
I think it's a resource issue in terms of where you actually spend the limited amount of resources. I've seen all of the candidates have at least been in the area physically, but from a television perspective, the amount of money that is spent on television ads, some of them are trying to save that money for Election Day and a ground game, and it will be very interesting to see how many individual voters that the early vote captures. I think many people are spending a lot of money on a ground game, trying to get people to the polls early, trying to get people to vote before Election Day. And with all the changes in the laws with respect to early voting, many individuals are voting even before the March 20th primary.
I just heard, talk about Pat Quinn, I've just heard a couple radio pieces. That's it, no television, I haven't seen any television. I haven't watched much television lately, but listen to radio in the car and at the house, and I've heard Pat Quinn a couple times, that's it.
It's really tough for Pat Quinn to change his image very much at this stage in his life. Everybody's got an opinion that's been here at least, and he may be saving it for the general election, but he's never been all that great at raising money. I mean, he played the outsider forever and reveled in that, and then he got elected governor and continued to play the outsider game. And now I think he's reaping some of the disadvantages of having played that game that way that long.
Linda, I might just ask you, what has been the reaction in Springfield to this poll? I know you've spent a lot of time there. Clearly, it confirms the general impressions that have been out there, but have you picked up anything in particular about the poll that strikes lawmakers in Springfield?
I think the local piece, the fact that politics is local, has been one that has resonated with many of the, especially House members, because they run every 2 years, and they don't have a wide area. So they need to make sure that as they are working, that they're working their precincts. I've seen more and more people take leave of absence during this time to actually stay at home and not be in Springfield, and actually at home on the ground in their districts. And I think that is one of the things that is, I think, very different this year than in years past. Some of the individuals that would probably take a primary, not necessarily for granted, but wouldn't have to work as hard. I think those House members are working harder this time around for their seats. They're getting out, going door to door, letting people know what they're doing. And the poll actually, it was clear that at the federal level, as well as at the state level, not as much, but locally, people like their local politicians. And I think the zest to get out there and the need to get out there, I think this poll confirmed it. People are talking about it, and I think we're going to see a lot of people over the next 2 weeks getting out, knocking door to door.
I will say as a follow-up, we get over 2-year period at least a lot of follow-up quotes of our polling on issues like the marijuana thing or like redistricting. Chicago media, Trib and Sun-Times and others come back to our poll again and again. So these things have some lifespan that is actually kind of surprising, particularly on those policy issues that extend across General Assemblies for 2 or 3 sessions.
I might just say quickly, I was in Chicago last week at an event hosted by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations or Global Affairs, and a number of the diplomats had been following the poll and were particularly interested in, I mean, just the mood of the state, just saying, you know, how can you sustain a democracy when 84, 85% of the respondents say the state is going in the wrong direction. But as John and Linda have said, that this protracted battle between the two parties, particularly on budget issues, has played out so long and has sort of sapped the goodwill of the people of Illinois that they're just angry at everyone, it seems.
That shows that the use of the poll information shows the integrity and the push and the clarity that Simon Polls put out there, the effort. I would say, like you say, 2-3 years down the road, they're still quoting Simon Polls.
We pay him to do that. He's sitting down here for a reason. Joe.
So with the question about the motivation, the Democratic motivation, I think I'm right. With the Democratic motivation for voting, and then as well with the coattail voting that you mentioned, or the lack thereof, do you see the Illinois congressional delegation in the next 4 years changing very much, the composition of that? Because we have, what, like 11 out of 18 are Democrats, so I'm just wondering if you see that changing to more Democratic representatives, things like that in the future.
Well, I think the test case is right here in the 12th district. This started out as competitive leans Republican in the Boss district. All the national rankings now have moved it from competitive leans Republican to competitive, and I think that's probably about right. I expect Brendan Kelly to be the nominee on the Democratic side, and I think that'll be a knockdown, drag-out battle. And the RNC and DNC and RCCC and DCCC will spend a ton of money in here because they know that it's competitive. And that's probably that, and one of the suburban ones in the Chicago area are the 2 test cases. I've forgotten, one of the Republicans is in trouble in suburban Chicago. Do you remember which one that is?
Which one is now?
One of the Republicans in suburban Chicago is reputed to be in about that same situation. So this one is 18, we'll do the census in 20, and so that's all up in the air because of what the presidential election does. And then we'll redistrict, and it'll be a new ball game after the 20, starting in 22. It's the best way I can respond to that.
I might just add one other thing, playing off John's point. We're going to be having an event in early May on the census and its implications for the region that you might want to pay attention to, because that is going to be, under the best of circumstances, it's hard to do the census right. And I think there's a lot of concern that there's going to be a lot of groups that are not fully represented. So I think it's on May 1, we'll be having an event. You might keep your eyes open for that, because that should be something that everyone is very interested in the community.
Thanks. I have a comment first and then a question. You were talking about early voting earlier, and I've been doing a lot of phone banking and canvassing for 3 different candidates over the last several months, and in the last week and a half, we're getting an awful lot of people that are saying, I already voted, when we call them. So there is a huge,
Yes.
huge early
And that's a
voter
sign
turnout.
of, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is I've noticed that there's a lot of polarization, not just between the two parties, but within the parties when there are competitive races between candidates, both on the Democratic and the Republican side. How do you think that's going to play out after the primary? Are they going to be able to all like pull together and support the candidate that won the primary, or are we going to have like all these split factions all over the place again?
There's usually a coming home of the parties, and I think that in order to be competitive in the general, the parties have to come together. I mean, and it's been done time and time. I think I talked to a Democrat and a Republican yesterday, and they were talking about how bad it was in their particular area. And so there will be some bringing people together around common issues, because ultimately the party wants the seat. And so they'll have to come together.
Yeah, look at the Republican Party coming together behind Trump as soon as he won. I mean, people said really nasty things about one another, and they all got pretty much on board as soon as taking power, then prospect thereof concentrates the mind. So I would guess mostly they will. There have been some pretty nasty commercials, though. If you look at Ives versus Rauner, particularly, she's put out some damaging stuff, and some of that he'll have to work to overcome if he's the nominee.
It's not just the commercials, it's the supporters on
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is even worse because people have no restraints on social media. We've either bored you to death or worn you out. Any last, yes, right here.
Yes, I don't know if you've already covered this, but what's your feeling if someone has already run before and their name recognition as opposed to someone that is new for that position? Do you think it weighs in on the actual process for the primary or not?
I think it depends on how they did when they ran before. Mostly, if they won and they're the incumbent, they have an enormous advantage. If they lost, then they got some name ID and got known, but it wasn't enough to carry them over. The challenger has to get the name ID and get out there and get known, and has particularly to depend on some ground game, or if they've got money, the challenger's got to spend some money that the person that's run before may not have to spend. That's not a very good answer, but I think that's the way that generally works. Depends on the outcome. I think I know which race you're talking about. Mayor.
Yeah.
This is not within this poll, but from your bank of wisdom and experience in Illinois, what are the probabilities of a state budget this year?
If I had a crystal ball.
Yeah, that's tough. I was encouraged by about the first 80% of the governor's state of the state, and then he turned completely 180 degrees in the last 20% and said Madigan, Madigan, Madigan over and over again. So that's no way to get a budget or get policy done, and so that made me more troubled by. And then the budget address was also a very mixed bag, and it depends, is he running for re-election or is he trying to govern? And those don't go well at this point. And I'm not sure, the Democrats are certainly not going to help him. I don't know, some of them may want a budget and may want the government to work. That's allegedly what Democrats want, but at election time, they won't get reelected. So the calculus is going to be, how much do we have to continue to beat up on Rauner and make him look bad in order to win in the fall, and how much do we really, and more importantly, do our interest groups and constituencies really want a budget so the government won't be at loggerhead, and universities and K through 12 and community colleges and that whole array of human services area don't suffer again the way they did for over 2 years. And each party's got to make that calculus, and I'm not sure which side they're going. We could have a rerun of this thing, and as a university person, I think that'd be disastrous.
Linda, I'm asking you, what do you think the chance is?
Quite a bit, you know,
Sorry.
this question. And the solution that I've come up with is one party, and I really don't care if it's Democrat or Republican, it'll probably be Democrat, needs to get a hold of this state and get us back on track. We're just not getting anything done with this partisanship that's going on here. The city of Carbondale's working on its budget. Last year, we cut 5%, and then we lost $520,000 in the middle of our budget year, and so did other cities lost proportional amount. As the state took away in the local government distributive fund, trying to balance their own budget, which they did not do. The governor's budget for this year is saying a like amount is going to come out this year, and we're not going to start from where we were last year. We're going to start from where we are now. So the city's looking at $1 million or 5% budget cut. That's just coming from the state. We've told our departments to cut 10%, which they're doing right now. But it's reaching the point of being just catastrophic for the state of Illinois. We all know we're driving people away, we're driving investors away. And do you feel like one party could get, that's the only solution? I mean, I can't come up with another one, and I'm a pretty sharp guy, I think.
You want to take that?
Well, clearly, when you think about the fact that the state has run for 2 years based on consent decrees, I mean, those individuals that sued got paid. Those that didn't file suit just waited. There are many providers that they have just about caught up, state employee group insurance and other things. So I think that there will be hope. I can't say that there will be a budget this time. There is at least is the will. I think people are talking, but the bottom line is it'll go down to the last days, I think, before we really know what is going to happen. But the day of reckoning, at some point, you can't continue to cut. We can't continue to cut our way out of it. And there's going to have to be some tough decisions made. Maybe they're by the Democrats, maybe they're by the Republicans, maybe they come together on a solution, but something is going to have to give because, as you say, universities can't continue. The president came this morning before the House Education Committee talking about the cuts that had already been made in higher education, the number of jobs that have not been filled on this campus and on campuses around the state. So clearly, I think knowing what the problem is, I think they understand what the problem is. The question becomes, how do they come up with a solution where both sides win, especially in an election year when the name of the game at this point for both of them is the majorities and winning the governor's seat on the Democratic side, winning the governor's seat on the Republican side. How do they come together for the good of the state? And that's a $1 billion question.
I'm going to say, I don't think that's going to happen until we cut the Coke cartel reins that they have over the Midwest. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest agendas that we're looking at now. They created this agenda in 2012. They've placed all their governors in their states. They groomed Pence for his position. And they have a stronghold over Illinois. They have major industries in Alton. They have a stronghold over SIU and other universities. And until we look at that agenda and look at that plan in statewide and nationally and globally, then we can understand how to work Illinois politics. We need to get it back. And I think that is what we need to look at and what we need to cut.
I happen to be looking today at a map of the Illinois legislative districts, and it's really bizarre. And part of what the mayor was talking about in terms of trying to get a budget, it seemed to me that part of the problem is that in the past, those legislative districts have been drawn in a way that makes a lot of them safe for one party or the other. And there's not a whole lot of incentive there to compromise and try to work things out. And so I guess my question is what are the prospects of redistricting process changing by the time we get the 20 census results, which you mentioned?
By
Because
then,
that seems to me to be one of the issues that's got to be dealt with.
by then, I'd say they're slim and none. We've been doing redistricting ever since there's been a Paul Simon Institute, and we've been advocates for doing it differently. So we're pretty much on record, but it's not certainly going to happen before the next go-round, and probably not even after that. It's very tough to get it done. Illinois is clearly redistricted now to favor the Democrats somewhat, and yet that leaves what you just said, which is a lot of safe red seats and even more safe blue seats. Now, if you take that at a national level, most people in Illinois are surprised to learn the nation is gerrymandered way in favor of the Republicans, because there are way more Republican-controlled states than there are Democratic-controlled states as a result of the 2014 midterms and the 2010 midterms, which we're still living with the reverberation of that. And so that's why I've been saying this talk about a blue wave is tempered by that national gerrymander. But it is different in Illinois because, as you know, Democrats control that. And as long as there's Mike Madigan, it's going to be really tough to get that changed. And the General Assembly, by our Constitution, is in control of redistricting in Illinois, and General Assembly not likely to give that up, even if the Republicans control General Assembly. Linda, you take off on that.
No, I absolutely agree, and as Dr. Jackson said, we tried when the Republicans were in charge. We've tried to do it when the Democrats are in charge, but the redistricting process is the process by which it's a process that's controlled by the legislature, and they're not really in a position to want to give that up. And so unless the process is changed, no matter who's in charge, it will be that party that controls the way the maps are drawn. And I don't think that's going to change anytime in the near future.
That is at the core of polarization nationally. Right there is a big part of the whole explanation, not the whole explanation, but a significant part of the explanation.
Is that an Illinois Constitution change that has to take place?
Yes.
Tough to do. Tough to do.
Oh.
Sharon.
Yes, I know with our commander and Twitter or whatever he is, all this has been going on about the social media and the impact. But as you talk to voters in Illinois and you talk about and you study and you research voters, how much do you think they are impacted now? I know I've heard you talk about the television ads. And also, I'm the old-time campaigner, which you helped teach me to do, knocking on the doors, the always face-to-face contact. But do you see now, I mean, a lot of the younger candidates seem to swear by advertising and working almost, completely on social media.
I mean, I think you're right in the sense that there's been a sea change in terms of how important social media is in campaigns. And maybe 20 years ago, TV was everything. I think the power of TV has been significantly reduced. It's still very, very important. It's a huge advantage to have control of enough funds to dominate the airwaves. But I think you're right. Social media has become increasingly important in terms of identifying voters, getting your base, focused on and energized and activated. So that's one of the big things I think political scientists 100 years from now will be looking at, is just when what was sort of the tipping point in which social media became so important.
And the advertising's so cheap on there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe a final question or two.
Over here.
How about,
Okay.
I think hers is on social media, so let's get this, and Lauren, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I've been hi, my name's Julie. I've been a door knocker, canvasser for 15 years, but I have been professionally trained in social media marketing, and I'm doing grassroots campaigns and other campaigns as well, the strongest candidate. And I will say the tipping point was the presidential primary of the last election. That's when candidates started forming big dumps of money for buying comments and buying the social media because they realized, wow, the polls are really different because this cheap and free at times, I mean, they're starting to charge more and more for it, and we'll see the price go up as it's getting used more. But I think it'll be really interesting. I think this election will be the very first one we see what the real result of that is. I think the ones that are canvassing, we keep seeing early voting, and we see this big rush of voters going out. So newspaper and TV is kind of the voting demographic age range, but we're going to see if new voters are coming out and what part social media plays in that. So I think that's happening right now. We're watching it.
Okay, so this question might also be something that you could respond to too then. But my question with the social media and campaigns that go that route are that even social media is driven with algorithms. So you've got a lot of people that are influenced, but they're only seeing their bubble of interest. So Democrats, I think, that were shocked by Trump's win because they were only surrounded by similar ideas or concepts that encouraged them that that Trump wasn't going to win. So when thinking about campaigns in the future, and then also dealing with the algorithms that go into social media groups like Facebook and other things like that, I don't know how, if you maybe had a response to this too, since you're working on, you've been studying that as an expertise, like how do you control that? And also with the television, I personally can't even afford television as a grad student, so a lot more people have access to social media and outlets, with news coverage there than they even do if they're, in a position of not being able to afford cable bills. And then even the cable is controlled now, depending on the community, like they'd have to go through like different providers, if I understand correctly. So I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say the algorithms are defined by the person doing the social media marketing. So I've seen politicians, and especially grassroots politicians that have no campaign funds, do some really bad social media marketing, and they get a bunch of negative comments on there, and they're paying $100 a day to get negative press for themselves. But if I were to put in my own demographics for a candidate, I would put, like, if I were looking for new voters in the black districts, I might do Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, and maybe something else that relates to that age demographic, new voters, people turning 18, or maybe college scouting. I might not even put anything in the demographics that would have anything to do with politics, just maybe something that would interest the party that I'm fine honing for.
Great, thank you. Well, why don't we wrap it up with that exchange? And thank you all very much for coming. And if you want to have some more polling, please feel free to jump on our website. We have lots of more information in greater detail. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in the fall. Thank you.